Today, I'll be revisiting my essay on Chelsea Ortega's claim that hope functions as a mechanism of colonial control rather than a path to liberation for indigenous peoples. In that essay, I argued that hope, when tethered to settler promises, disciplines indigenous peoples into waiting, into what Ortega calls colonial timelines. Liberation, I concluded, comes not through this hopeful waiting, but through refusal, sorrow, and remembrance. But in light of other thinkers, like Helen Nyor, Ryan Gustafson, and Edward Said. I want to test how far that conclusion holds. Each of these writers complicates Ortega's framework by rethinking how embodied subjects live under systems that defer or deny belonging. So, my central question today is: to what degree does Ortega's rejection of colonial hope still hold when we think about home, habit, and exile through these other philosophical lenses? Let's start briefly with Ortega. Ortega's argument in Another Day in the Colony is not an abstract moral claim about optimism or pessimism, it's a political one that hope functions as a colonial technology of delay. Hope encourages Indigenous peoples to wait for justice, for recognition, for treaty, for inclusion, but within a structure that was never built for them. It binds sovereignty to the settler imagination. Drawing on Clifford and Fanon, I describe this as kind of a affective dependency. Indigenous peoples are invited to feel invested in colonial recognition, to experience hope as emotional alignment with the colonizers' timelines. So my essay concluded that refusal of hope and insistence on living outside settler fertility becomes an act of sovereignty. But is this outright rejection of hope sustainable across other experiences of displacement and control? This is where I turn to No, Gustafsson, and Said. Helen Neo's The Habits of Racism explores how racialization operates not only through laws or overt discrimination, but through the habits of bodily perception, the sedimented ways of seeing, moving, and responding in a racialized world. For Neo, oppression is not simply imposed externally, it's incorporated into the body through habit. Every gesture, every flinch or hesitation carries history. In this sense, Neo complicates Ortega's argument that hope simply disciplines indigenous peoples from the outside. Colonial power, Neo would say, is not only temporal, but phenomenological. It lives in the microstructures of embodiment, in how one learns to walk, speak, and inhabit public space. So, whereas Ortega's hope is sort of like a temporal deferral, Neo's habit is a spatial and a bodily deferral. The body learns where it cannot go, where it cannot expect, and what futures it cannot inhabit. If we take Neo seriously, Ortega's conclusion that liberation lies in refusal becomes harder to maintain as a total position, because refusal, like hope, also happens through habit. If one's body is habituated into a racialized world, can refusal itself ever stand outside that world? Neo suggests that even our refusals risk being reabsorbed into familiar postures, defensive, vigilant, exhausted. Thus, while Ortega's call to reject hope remains politically necessary, Neo's phenomenology shows that the capacity to refuse this is constrained by how bodies are shaped to anticipate domination. The question becomes not simply whether to hope, but how to unlearn the bodily habits of colonial time. Ryan Gustafson's essay, Thinking Trans Embodiment, on contingent home and trans fatigue, introduces a framework that reframes this entire discussion around the phenomenology of home. Gustafsson critiques the idea of home as a final or proper destination, what they call destinational home. Instead, they propose the idea of contingent home, a temporary situated sense of belonging forged through everyday acts of survival, or what Maureen Ortega calls home tactics. This has striking parallels with Ortega's critique of colonial hope. Both reject futurity as a promise destination. Ortega resists the promise of future, while Gustafsson resists the idea of a future, proper body, or authentic home. Yet Gustafsson's concept of contingent home softens Ortega's rejectionist stance, where Ortega's refusal risks collapsing into all or nothing politics. Hope versus sovereignty, Gustafsson offers a meanwhile ethics, small imperfect spaces of rest and endurance within ongoing exhaustion. Their notion of trans fatigue, the depletion caused by constantly navigating an unhomely world, resonates powerfully with Watego's description of indigenous exhaustion under endless waiting. But Gustafson's point is that livability requires meanwhile homes, even inside oppressive structures. Thus, where my essay sees hope as a colonial trap, Gustafsson suggests that even within unfreedom, there can be contingent gestures of homemaking, brief reprieves that sustain life. This doesn't invalidate Watego and therefore my conclusion, but complicates the scope that I had come to. Perhaps refusing hope entirely risks erasing the meanwhile sites of survival, those small lived acts of sovereignty that happen not through grand refusal, but through persistence. Turning now to Edward Said's states, we encounter another kind of dislocation, the exile of Palestine people. Said writes not about home as a destination, but as a haunting absence, something both longed for and irretrievably lost. His essay on displacement reveals a tension between memory and mobility. Wherever we Palestinians are, he says, we are not in our Palestine. For Said, hope is never absent, but it's painfully ironic. He speaks of a hopeful persistence that refuses annihilation, even as it recognizes the impossibility of return. This form of hope, what we might call tragic hope, seems to contradict Watego's rejection of hope entirely. For Watego, hope in the colonizer's future is submission. For Said, hope in spite of despair is survival. Yet even here, there's overlap. Both thinkers expose how political narratives of progress, whether the Zionist return or settler reconciliation, mask ongoing dispossession. And both insist on memory as a counter to forgetting that. Still, Said refuses to surrender to nihilism. His exilic consciousness thrives in displacement, in the act of narrating itself, of insisting on presence in absence. Hope for Said becomes an act of narration rather than expectation. It's not the hope that something will come, it's the insistence that we are still here. So, in relation to my essay, Said reframes hope not as control, but as resistance through continuity. Not the waiting Watego rejects, but the storytelling that keeps the people in time when the world insists they are outside of it. So, where does this leave my original conclusion that liberation requires the rejection of colonial hope? I think the conclusion still holds, but only partially. If we take Watego literally, that all hope tied to futurity is colonial, we risk losing the phenomenological complexity that No, Gustafsson, and Said bring. From No, we learn that oppression lives in the body's habits. Refusal alone cannot unmake what is sedimented. Liberation must include embodied unlearning. From what Gustafsson, we learn that life under domination depends on contingent homes, temporary spaces of ease, where hope might flicker, not as trust in power, but as endurance. From endurance, sorry. From Said, we learn that the politics of exile require narrative persistence, a form of hope that sustains identity when belonging is impossible. Taken together, they suggest that Watego's critique of colonial hope remains valid as a political diagnosis, but not as a total account of human possibility. Hope can indeed function as colonial control when it is delegated by the state, deferred to the future, or conditioned on recognition. But embodied hope, the hope of rest, of contingent home, of narrating survival, remains indispensable to any politics of liberation. In other words, the problem is not hope itself, but whose temporality it serves. To conclude, Watego's warning still matters, especially in settler colonial contexts like Australia, where reconciliation often functions as a promise of progress that never arrives. Her refusal of hope protects against this sedative politics of waiting. Yet in dialogue with No, Gustafsson, and Said, we come to see that hope need not always be colonizing. When hope emerges from the colonizer's timeline, but from the textures of lived experience, the body learning to rest, the exiled voice narrating itself, the contingent act of homemaking, it becomes something else entirely. Not a mechanism of control, but a fragile practice of endurance. So perhaps the most honest conclusion is not reject hope, but reclaim it. To wrest hope from structures that weaponize it, and to ground it instead in the ongoing embodied and unfinished work of living on. Thank you. Here are my references.